Kirsty McNeill is Deputy Director of Save the Children and has been involved in several charities and voluntary organisations, as well as finding herself at the heart of government between 2007 and 2010. So please welcome Kirsty McNeill.
Thanks, Alistair, and thanks to all of you for having me today. I wanted to start by telling a story. I want to tell a story about who we are. I want to tell a story about where we've come from. And I want to tell a story about where we could go. So I came of age politically after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a time where it looked like the onward march of progress was inevitable, a time where the world was dominated by two ideals of human rights and ideals of international law. Things that we had fought for came to pass, and having come to pass, seemed as if they always would. Things like the cancellation of third world debt, things like the agreement of a doctrine called the responsibility to protect, to stand up and protect civilians if they were threatened with a genocide. Things like the Arms Trade Treaty, and then the darkness. If you just look at the last 3 years, so much that we fought for, so much that we believed was inevitable, has dissolved before our eyes. So 2015 was the year of the refugee, a time when global refugee figures were higher than at any point since World War II. 2016, the year of populism, a time where nativist, xenophobic populism took over much of the Western world and seemed unstoppable. 2017, the year we're in now, a year of famine, a year when 20 million people across 4 countries could starve to death in scenes that we haven't seen in over 3 decades. Something has gone very, very, very wrong. But I'm here today to ask you to help me and put it right, because I think the answer to the challenges we face can be found with activism and cooperation all around the world, but in particular, it can be found here in Scotland, and I want to talk to you about why. So my argument here is threefold: that we are at a particular moment in history, and it's a moment that I would call a movement moment, a moment that demands all of us to join movements in unprecedented numbers, because the problems that confront us are simply too big to be dealt with by politicians, however noble their intentions, however high their skills, too big to be dealt with public institutions, however high their competence or legitimate their intentions, too high to be dealt with by public policy alone. So that's my first argument. My second argument is that Scots in particular have very specific responsibilities in a movement moment such as this one, and that's because we believe in cooperation. Not simply cooperation in our communities, although we do, not simply in cooperation across our country, although we do, but in cooperation right across the world with people who need our help. So I'd say that thirdly, Scots have a particular agenda now. It is something that demands of us that we join movements for global justice and that are rooted in global cooperation, and that we do so because we've got something really distinctive to offer, and it's rooted in our historical experience. Whatever you think about how that came to be, it has given us quite a specific gift, and I'll talk about why. So let me begin by just saying why I think this is a movement moment. Let's talk a little bit about where we are now. So by day, as was mentioned, I work at Save the Children. And every day, I try to reflect on the things that we have achieved together. And these are your achievements. Since 1990, we have halved the number of children who die before their 5th birthday. Cut it in half in just a few decades. And if any of you have ever lost anyone, have ever been through a bereavement, you'll know that the loss of any individual is shattering. And we can talk about statistics, and we can talk about the size of the problem, but actually each and every one of these statistics is an individual family who now has a place at their dinner table that can never be filled by anybody else, because each and every human being is utterly unique, completely precious, and utterly irreplaceable. So that's a good reason to get up in the morning. That every morning I can say we have halved the number of families who experience that depth of sorrow and that earth-shattering grief. And that's not just people that Save the Children, that's people like you. So if you've ever given to an international charity, or actually even if you just pay your taxes and support those taxes being spent on global development concerns, then those are your achievements, and you should be so incredibly proud. So I try to hang on to that every day. But at the same time, there's another idea that competes with it for me every day, because every day I have to decide to choose optimism. I have to decide to look for the hope, because alongside those good news stories are some absolutely haunting stories that mean my mornings tend to evenings where it's difficult to sleep because I'm haunted by other things I've experienced. Just last week, we released a report telling the voices of the children of Syria. One boy said, "When my friends die, my chest hurts and I can't breathe, so I go and sit on my own because I don't want to scream at anyone." Words that no child anywhere should ever say, that a child would take themselves away to be on their own because they're so consumed by rage and despair at the world that we have gifted to them. Our report before that, we told the stories not of children, but of parents, and listened to parents who told us what it was like to deal with this dilemma, one I can barely begin to imagine. They lived in a besieged town in Syria, one that was under constant bombardment, one where all the schools were shut, because if you send children to school in those environments, the schools themselves are active targets. They don't get caught in the crossfire. They are actively targeted as acts of war. And inside that situation of besiegement, parents had experienced all of the doctors had been killed or fled. And in that environment, what did they do? They resorted to taking their children to the vet when they got sick. So that's the other side of the story here. We live in times of great optimism and potential, but also times of great darkness if we look around the world. But it's not just across the world, is it, that these things are happening? If we look across Europe, whether it's Paris, whether it's London, whether it's Madrid, we also see that extremists and terrorists are targeting and torturing and killing those who disagree with them. Right here in Britain, Jewish friends report that they are experiencing abuse that comes from the swamps of history. Muslim friends say they've never experienced such a tide of vulgar and blatant Islamophobia. And at the same time last year, my friend Jo Cox was murdered simply for doing her job. And behind all those trends, there is the same basic story. The same basic thing is happening. And it's this: frightened and frightening people are obsessing about what divides us and on where we disagree, not on what unites us or on the precious, unique contribution that every single human being has to give, and without whom our world would be irrevocably impoverished. And none of these are problems that politicians can cope with alone. They need us because these are societal forces that go beyond politics, and they need a societal-wide contribution. So if you're horrified by the picture I've just painted, you need to get involved. If you want a different Scotland, if you want a different Britain, if you want a different world, we need you to step up right now. And so for me, this is a movement moment that requires contributions from all of us, and it's a time that requires movement thinking. Now, why do I say that? Why do I say that this is a movement moment? It's not just because things have gone wrong, but it's because they've gone wrong in quite a particular way. We're in what I'd call a 3D world. D for disruption, for division, and for distrust. So we live in a time of deep distrust where people don't trust institutions to deliver for them anymore. They don't necessarily trust their neighbours. We don't trust one another. There are divisions between people because they have different political outlooks or because they come from different backgrounds. And there's disruption, as we've just heard, because there are new ways of thinking, doing, and being, and it can feel overwhelming as if change is outpacing us. Now, why would a movement, why would that way of thinking be an answer to all these things? Well, I'd say it's an answer to distrust, because movements are characterised by their perceived authenticity. It's an answer to division, because there's never been a movement of one. By definition, a movement is something we build together. And it's an answer to disruption, because movements are characterised by being in motion. They are themselves agile and outpace the societal forces that surround them. And then they give us a bit more of a sense of being in control. We know there has to be change, but it can be change that we choose. So this word gets bandied around a lot at the moment. People are talking about Trump as being the upsurge of a movement. People talked about Obama before that as being a movement too. So this isn't a new thing in the last 3 years. It's not even a new thing in the last few decades. There's always been movements. There was a movement for women's suffrage. There was a movement for temperance. There's been movements for civil rights. So it's not completely new. Now, my friend Alex Evans has just published a book in which he quotes a veteran US activist, Tom Gitlin, and he defines a movement like this. What makes a movement is simply enough people feeling part of it, sensing a shared culture, and forcing those who are watching to take note and take sides. And that is, I think, what a movement demands of us. It demands that we take sides on the great moral questions of the day. So there's nothing new about them, but I also want to posit today there's nothing inherently noble about them either, because when you're called upon to take sides, sometimes people pick the wrong one. So just because we admire civil rights, just because we admire the campaigners who were part of the movement to abolish slavery, doesn't mean that we should get confused. And we are guilty of this sometimes, and particularly here in Scotland. Just because something is insurgent, just because something is new, and just because something is a movement that sounds like it will disrupt the status quo, we still have to evaluate it critically and use all our faculties to work out, just because it's a movement, is it a movement in the right direction or the wrong direction? Because the global far right has its movement. Global jihadism is a movement. ISIS is a movement. The English Defence League is a movement. So I posit there's nothing intrinsically noble about a movement, and there's nothing intrinsically new. But despite my anxieties about them, I would nonetheless say this is a movement moment, and this is a movement moment where if we pick the right side and the right sorts of movements, something morally very special could happen that's of historic importance. So why am I talking about this here in Scotland? What has it got to do with you? I'd say it's incredibly Scottish in its nature, this movement moment. These hatreds might seem to you so big, and the divisions so great, and the potential to overwhelm the world so all-consuming, that you think there's nothing possibly to be done, certainly not from here in Scotland. But my answer is no. Scotland has a calling now. It's more important than ever that Scots in particular are at the forefront, and that's for a very simple reason. It's because we know better than anybody that division and people being put in boxes is not the way it has to be, because we have known now for several centuries that Scots can have an identity of their own choosing. That's why we've allowed people for 3 centuries to be Scottish and British. It's why some people now are so involved in the campaign to say, no, I want to be Scottish and European, not Scottish and British, because we know that fluid identities are part of what it is to be a Scot. That's why we can talk about somebody being Scots by birth, yes, but also Scots by choice or Scots by aspiration. And so my second argument today is precisely because there's nothing binary or closed about the identity of Scottishness, that we are very well placed to stand at the forefront of the movements that this particular time demands of us. So let me just say a little bit more about why. And this might be bewildering to visitors from Scotland who've heard me talk about this before. Given the mesmerising choice that we have the grandeur of our Munros, we have the histories and mysteries of our lochs, we have the breathtaking beauty of our islands and our glens. So why, with all those choices of sites that I could say to visitors from Scotland, you must see these, why instead do I direct people to 2 wee bits of stone? Because my favourite sites in Scotland are incredibly simple, they're incredibly plain, they're free to see, and you can go and see both of them within an hour from where we stand today. They're 2 wee bits of stone, and I'd say in them you see the essence of the Scottish national character. So the first is a circular inscription, which some of you may have seen, that's on the floor of the National Museum. And written in a circle are these words: from Scotland to the world to Scotland. So depending on where you look at the circle, it either says from Scotland to the world, or it says from the world to Scotland. And in that stone, at the heart of our National Museum, what we want to show the world is the idea that Scotland, yes, has a border, but actually our minds don't have them. Actually, Scotland is a good Samaritan, entirely bound up, inextricably morally, with the dependencies and fates of the other peoples of the world. It's something that's been true of us throughout history, and it's something we're very proud to still say today. My second favourite stone is the one in St Giles Cathedral, and it simply says this: "Thank God for James Young Simpson's discovery of chloroform magnesia in 1847. And it seems to me that in these two small slabs, much more actually than in our poetry, than in our plays, than in our political speeches, than in our songs, you see who we think we really are. Now, why am I so mesmerised by this somewhat strange slab that we have in our national cathedral? And for me, it says a few things about Scottishness. It says, yes, take pride in your temporal talents. Yes, take pride in your inventiveness. Yes, take pride in how practical the applications of your talents are. But at the same time, don't get too cocky. So it's all very well being the most inventive people on the face of the earth, but you didn't do this on your own, did you? So if you come from a Christian tradition, you think God helped you. But actually, if you come from other traditions in Scotland's national life, you'd say we all helped you and that we stand together in these kind of achievements. Now, the reason that second one is so important to me is because it's actually how I relate to my work at Save the Children and to my role as a campaigner. Because it's not enough to be a nice person, and it's not enough to have good intentions. You're supposed to hold yourself to account for that which you actually achieve. So when you did your hard work and you set out with your good intentions, did you invent something that's of historical significance and of use to other people? You're supposed to think hard, and then you're supposed to work hard. That's what it is if you're a Scot who really believes in social justice. Now, there isn't a phrase, there isn't a Scots word that encapsulates this idea that I nonetheless believe to be profoundly Scottish. And so I've characterised it this way. The best I could come up with is strategic service. So it's not just about service, and it's not just about strategy and being brainy. It's the combination of the two that makes something particularly Scottish, I believe. Now, I should also say at this stage, I don't actually consider these two national traits of ours, of this deep well of cooperation and internationally, and this deep well of strategic service. There are downsides, right? This isn't an unalloyed good, because the same way that those things can come together to make us capable of tremendous self-sacrifice and righteous fury and courage, it can also tip us over into being deeply self-righteous, deeply puritanical, and deeply judgmental, because we think it's so obvious what hard work demands of us now, and we can fall into judgment of those who don't agree with us. So I'm not saying that this is an unalloyed good, and I'm not saying that therefore Scots are somehow better than other people, but I am saying, and I hope you agree with me, that when we say "Hos like us, damn few," we're onto something. There is something distinctive about being Scottish. So my second argument today is there is something distinctive about being Scottish, and it's okay to say so. But at the same time, if I'm right, that distinctiveness in our Scottishness need not and must not take us off into saying we'll sort out our own problems, the forces that take over the world just now, the hatreds, the divisions, the challenges and the injustices are not for us to deal with, because in our distinctiveness, we must only look here at home. No, I'd say it's the exact opposite. And this is my third and final argument. If the two I've laid out so far are correct, then there has never been a greater demand of particular Scottish values, insights, mentalities and talents than the one we face today. And that's because in its richness and in its porousness and in its flexibility, the idea that you can be Scottish and many other things at once is precisely what movement builders need to have as a mentality. So let me just say a tiny bit about what that might look like. Firstly, I'd say if we were to join big movements, we need to recognise that they don't buy great men theories of history, okay? These are not about worshipping at the altar of one great leader. Actually, the most effective movements now are leader-full. They're not leaderless, they're leader-full. They are full of people who identify themselves as leaders through the kind of action that they inspire in others. So if you look at Refugees Welcome, if you look at Black Lives Matter, if you look at the women's marches around the inauguration weekend, nobody knows who's in charge of these things. They don't have a heroic celebrity leader, because we are all the leaders. We are all people who are in charge of it. So movements don't have celebrity leaders. They require all of us. But secondly, what they require of us is not simply our participation, but also our creativity and our commitment. They demand of us that we say and do things in the collective that none of us would be able to do on our own, and crucially, no one person would be able to plan on their own. And I want to just look at one example. So if we look at the Refugees Welcome movement for a moment, no one mastermind could have come up with everything that's happened. Some folk in Glasgow, and only folk in Glasgow would have done this, some folk in Glasgow started a whole new charity, Refugees, to welcome refugees to the city. And they welcomed them not simply with essentials like nappies, toiletries, toothpaste, food. They welcomed them with letters for the locals, where people said what we love about our city, the best places to go with your kids in Glasgow, what Iron Brew is like, which if you're a refugee from Syria probably took some explaining. So people said, this is what it means to come to Glasgow. But a totally different set of people said, well, the Syrian refugees that are coming to Butte, they'll need something different. And they went and spoke to the local minister of the church and said, could you give up the church hall for Friday prayers? And they went and spoke to the butcher at the local co-op and said, can you make sure you've got halal meat for when our new friends arrive? At the same time, a QC in London said, I'll set up a campaign for fundraising called Billable Hour, where I'll give what I would have made in an hour, what I would bill a client, and I'll give it to child refugees. He put it on Facebook. A few of his pals, who were also barristers, said, yeah, I'll do that too. And then some solicitors. And then the people who make the wigs for barristers said, yeah, we'll give you an hour of what we sell in our shop. And then the people who have the wine company that stock the sellers of the Inns of Court said, yeah, we'll give you it too. And then the legal publishers, and so on, getting community fundraising from a community that we didn't even know was there. Caitlin Moran at the same time said, me and all my friends from the music and pop industries, we'll make a single for you. Belle and Sebastian put on a gig at the SECC. At the same time, a member of the public started a petition that forced David Cameron into a U-turn when he'd said on the Thursday, not a single extra Syrian refugee will come here. By the Monday, she'd forced him into saying in Parliament, we'll take 20,000 extra. At the same time, a completely different woman said on Facebook, I'm going to go to Parliament Square and make my thoughts known. Does anyone want to join me in a protest, thinking that 10 or 20 people might come? And within 2 weeks, she was leading a march of 10,000 people through the streets of London. I didn't do that. None of the credit belongs to Save the Children, belongs to Refugee Action, belongs to the Refugee Council. None of the credit belongs to any one organisation or any one person. It belongs to the power of a movement where people decide to contribute creatively that which is in their power to give, and then something magical happens when it's more than the sum of the parts. Now, I don't want to claim here that, and I know this has been claimed, I don't subscribe to the view that Scots are inherently more progressive on this question than people down south or people anywhere else. But I do subscribe to the thought that we can be extremely proud of this deep well of internationalism and movement thinking that you see not only in the refugee welcome kind of environment, you see it in the disproportionate number of Scots who signed up for the international brigades, you see it in the amazing outpouring of people power that you saw in the streets of Edinburgh in the run-up to the 2005 Gleneagles Make Poverty History Summit. So there is something special that happens in Scotland where we decide to all contribute that which we can. And so the final point I want to leave you with is this one. Being a movement builder requires us to connect with people at the very deepest values level, not on the basis of what they do, what they buy, what they own, but on the basis of what they are. So a movement, if it's to be worthy of the name, has to have mass participation. But there's plenty of things that have mass participation and aren't movements. So lots of us have an iPhone, lots of us wear Converse shoes, lots of us wear Uber, lots of us use Airbnb, but no one says they're part of the movement for these things. These are just things that we do. They're not things that we are. And likewise, and I know this is very contested in Scotland, but no matter how loyal you are to a political party or to an individual charity, actually at a values level, that's just something you do. What you're actually more connected to on the values level is what it says about who you are and the bigger movement of which it is part. So just one example, if you look at Twitter, no one has in their biography, I am a donor to the Fawcett Society. They say feminist. No one says, I'm a supporter of hope, not hate. They say proudly anti-fascist. And no one says, I'm a member of Amnesty International. They say, I am a human rights defender. Because actually, we've already started to connect at this values level with mass participation that expresses who we truly are and the kind of world that we truly want to create. And so I think we've come full circle back to the idea I started with. I find this comes very naturally to me as a way of thinking. Being a movement builder isn't my profession, but it is my identity. And one of the reasons I find it easy, and one of the reasons I suspect that lots of you as Scots or people who live in Scotland would find it easy too, is because duality is part of what it is to be Scottish. So we are used to being Scottish and British, not Scottish or British. Now, there are plenty of you, I'm sure, who want there to be a second referendum and who would vote for independence if it came. There's certainly plenty of people who want those two things too in my own friends and family and my nearest and dearests. It's not my job today to pass judgment on that or to suggest what you should do. But I do want to say that there is something precious that comes from our historical experience of union that allows us to be more than one thing at once. And if you agree with me that it's precious, whatever you think about the referendum, we should think about how we harness it and protect it through the debate and division that we're about to have. We should take this as something that we are proud of and seek to protect, whilst also gifting it to the world at this time when the world so desperately needs us. So over the course of this weekend and over the course of the months and years to come, of course we'll debate. We will debate fiercely, and you may disagree with the particular premium that I put on this consequence of our historical perspective, and that's fine. But I hope the one thing that we can agree on, notwithstanding that the national question is really complex, there is one thing which is really simple, which is our world is hurting, it is broken, and the only thing that can heal it and bring it back together is a willingness of all of us to come together and participate in movements. And if we believe that this is a movement moment, and we believe of anything to be Scottish is to be a movement builder, then I hope we can also believe that despite our divisions, the one thing that should bring us together is the need to participate in the healing of our broken world and the knowledge that if movements need any group of people at any point in history, they need Jock Tamson's bairns and they need us now.